Imagine this: two massive ships, bristling with the pride of the British Empire, set sail from London in 1845 with over 120 hand-picked men. Their mission was nothing less than conquering the last unmapped section of the Arctic, to etch Britain's name permanently into the geography of the world. Yet only a few years later, both ships, the Erebus and the Terror, were found abandoned. Their crews vanished, their fate locked in ice and silence. What really happened to the Franklin expedition? And why, decades later, when scraps of evidence finally began to emerge, were some of the most revealing documents, the final diaries, mysteriously altered, censored, or even destroyed? Tonight we open this cold case and look at the clues one by one, as though they were exhibits laid out in a courtroom of history. Let's begin at the crime scene. Picture the vast Arctic wilderness. Blinding white snow, endless horizons, ice thicker than the hull of any wooden ship could withstand. In such an environment, every mistake is fatal. Franklin's expedition was supposed to be equipped for the worst. The latest technology of the mid-19th century, steam engines, preserved food sealed in tins, reinforced hulls. Yet those very advantages became part of the tragedy. When search parties finally found traces of the expedition years later, they discovered abandoned camps, skeletal remains scattered in the snow, and inscriptions carved into stone. One note in particular, known as the Victory Point Record, was found hidden inside a cairn. It stated that Franklin had died in 1847, and that the surviving officers and men had deserted the ships in April 1848. But beyond this brief note, where were the personal journals, the daily logs that every naval officer was trained to keep? Why did the trail of ink go suddenly silent at the most desperate moment? Exhibit A: the missing diaries. In most naval disasters, records are later recovered. Waterlogged logbooks, scattered pages, anything that might preserve the voices of the dead. With Franklin, however, the surviving notes are strangely incomplete. We have careful records up to 1847, and then a void. Searchers in the 1850s and 1860s reported that Inuit guides had seen papers in abandoned camps, and some documents did make it back to Britain. But according to later testimony, many of these diaries were deliberately withheld from public view, filtered through the Admiralty before any information was released. What could be so damning, so embarrassing, that officials chose silence over disclosure? To understand, we need to examine Exhibit B, the condition of the bodies. In the 1980s, forensic scientists exhumed 3 remarkably preserved corpses buried on Beechey Island. Their faces, frozen in time, looked almost alive. Autopsies revealed alarmingly high levels of lead in their bones and tissues, suggesting chronic poisoning. Where did the lead come from? The leading theory points to the very tinned food meant to save them. At the time, canning was a new process, and the solder used to seal the tins was rich in lead. Over months of consumption, this invisible poison could have slowly destroyed their minds and bodies. Picture sailors descending into confusion, hallucinations, paralysis. Imagine keeping a diary while your hand trembled. Your thoughts turned to fog. Perhaps the last journals contained evidence of madness, evidence too scandalous for the Admiralty to admit, because it would mean that Britain's great Arctic expedition collapsed not due to heroic struggle with nature, but due to its own flawed technology. Exhibit C complicates the picture further. In the 1850s, searchers recovered bones from King William Island, and many showed cut marks consistent with dismemberment. The implication was grim. Some of the starving men had resorted to cannibalism. Inuit oral histories, passed down through generations, corroborated this, describing men seen boiling human flesh in pots. For Victorian Britain, the idea that Her Majesty's finest officers had eaten their dead was unthinkable. So what happened to the documents that may have confirmed this? Did Franklin's men record their descent into desperation, only for those words to be quietly buried in Admiralty archives? When Charles Dickens himself wrote about the expedition, He dismissed Inuit testimony as unreliable and refused to believe British sailors could commit such acts. But history, as it so often does, had other ideas. Exhibit D is the strange absence of Franklin's own personal diary. Sir John Franklin was not only an officer, but a seasoned explorer. He was meticulous, and we know from his earlier expeditions that he kept journals. And yet, when search parties scoured the camps, no trace of his diary was ever found. Some speculate it was lost to the ice. Others suggest it was recovered, but suppressed, because within its pages, Franklin may have recorded the earliest signs of collapse. Mutinies brewing, officers disagreeing on survival strategies, discipline crumbling under Arctic pressure. To reveal such chaos would have shattered the heroic myth of noble endurance that Victorian Britain wanted to project. Now let's turn to the question of why this suppression mattered so much. For the British Admiralty, the Franklin expedition was more than exploration. It was propaganda. Success meant power, prestige, and proof that Britain ruled not only the seas, but the frozen ends of the earth. A humiliating story of poisoned sailors and cannibal survivors would tarnish that image. So instead, official narratives emphasized courage, faith, and sacrifice. The lost diaries, had they been released, might have told a darker truth. We are left, then, with fragments. A terse note about Franklin's death. Inuit testimony of dying men wandering the ice. Skeletal remains gnawed by knives. The rest remains hidden in silence. But silence itself can be evidence. The missing diaries raise unsettling questions. Were they destroyed, or do they still lie, misfiled or hidden, in some Admiralty vault? And if they exist, do they describe the true final days of Erebus and terror? Days of hunger, despair, and betrayal? Or do they contain an even stranger revelation? Something we cannot yet imagine. As we continue through this investigation, we must follow each clue, each testimony, and each piece of forensic evidence, piecing together what the missing words might have said. Because in the end, the most haunting detail of all is not the ice, not the bones, not the lead, but the silence where voices should be. As we reconstruct this grim puzzle, more exhibits come into play. Consider Exhibit E, the testimony of Inuit hunters who encountered the survivors. These accounts, passed down orally and later recorded by explorers like Charles Francis Hall in the 1860s, describe desperate men dragging sledges, gaunt and barely human, begging for food, sometimes incoherent. The Inuit remembered them as strangers wandering through a frozen hellscape. Some even reported seeing books and papers clutched in their hands, which were later abandoned. If those papers were diaries, where did they go? Did searchers recover them, only to have officials quietly consign them to locked drawers in the Admiralty's archives? The absence of such crucial testimony in the official narrative is itself suspicious. Imagine standing in the Arctic, holding a final diary page stained by frostbite trembling hands, and realizing that you now possess the last words of a dying man. Would you release them to the world if they told a story Britain would rather bury? Exhibit F brings us to a darker possibility. Forensic studies on the bones recovered from King William Island revealed not only cut marks, but also something even more disturbing: signs of marrow extraction. This suggests that survivors not only ate the flesh of the dead, but cracked bones open to extract every last calorie of fat. Such details are not speculation. They were identified by modern forensic anthropology. What if the missing diaries described these acts in the men's own words? The horror of reading a first-person account of cannibalism among naval officers would have been beyond what Victorian society could tolerate. Better, perhaps, to let those pages vanish into silence than to risk shattering the myth of honorable endurance. But the mystery doesn't end there. In 2014 and 2016, Canadian archaeologists made a shocking discovery. The wrecks of Erebus and Terror were found astonishingly well preserved in the frigid waters. Inside, divers reported sealed compartments that may still hold documents, artifacts, and perhaps even logbooks that ICE had kept intact for nearly 2 centuries. The possibility that Franklin's final diaries, or at least the ship's logs, could be waiting inside these wrecks is tantalizing. Yet access is tightly controlled, and so far no such journals have been made public. Could it be that once again, when evidence emerges, authorities will choose secrecy? After all, if those logs contradict the official story, revealing incompetence, mutiny, or worse, then the ghost of this expedition will continue to haunt both the Arctic and the archives. Now we must weigh the suspects, as in any case. Was the culprit lead poisoning? The scientific evidence is compelling, and diaries may have revealed the mental collapse of officers and crew. Was the true killer the environment itself? The unforgiving ice-crushing ships, cutting off escape, forcing starvation? The surviving records confirm this brutal struggle. Or was the true force behind the mystery the Admiralty itself, shaping the narrative, selecting which documents to release and which to hide? If so, then the last diaries were not destroyed by Arctic cold, but by bureaucratic fire. And here is where the contradictions sharpen. Some historians argue that the missing diaries never existed in the first place, that the men were too weak to write in their final days. Yet Inuit testimony of papers abandoned at camps suggests otherwise. Others claim that the diaries may still exist, buried deep in the National Archives, misfiled under some innocuous label. The question then becomes, what would happen if one day they were found? Would they confirm the story of poison, madness, and cannibalism? Or would they reveal something even stranger? Perhaps a mutiny against Franklin's authority? Or conflicts between officers, a collapse of order that Britain could never admit. The very absence of these diaries gives them more power than their presence ever could. As we close this investigation, imagine the scene once more. Endless ice, wind howling across frozen ridges, a line of starving men dragging a sledge heavy with books, silver, and perhaps their commanding officer's last journal. Somewhere along that journey, those words vanished. We are left only with fragments, testimonies, and bones. And yet, in that silence, there lingers a voice, faint but insistent, asking us to keep searching. Because the Franklin expedition was not only a tragedy of exploration, it was a story about how truth itself can be buried, frozen in ice or locked in archives, waiting for the right moment to resurface. If this mystery pulled you into the frozen Arctic and left you with more questions than answers, then you are exactly where the Franklin expedition has always left us, on the edge of discovery, haunted by what we do not know. If you want to continue this journey into the archives of history's enigmas, where silence speaks as loudly as words, then join us by leaving a like, sharing this investigation with others, and subscribing to Enigma Archives, because together we will keep reopening the cold cases of the past, and perhaps one day unseal the last pages of Franklin's missing diaries.